Good evening, everyone. I'm Chris Dixon, the Interim Executive Dean of the Faculty of Arts at Macquarie University, and it's my privilege to be chairing this event this evening. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land upon which the Macquarie University City Campus is located, the Gadigal people of the Aurora Nation, and also the traditional custodians of the Macquarie University of Wallamatigal campus in Macquarie Park, the Wallamatigal clan of the Darug Nation. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge all First Nations people here tonight. Welcome everyone to this special event on a free press and the national security, jointly presented by the Department of Media, Communications, Creative Arts, Language and Literature, the Department of Security Studies and Criminology, and the Centre for Media History within the Faculty of Arts at Macquarie University.
Bruce, thank you, and Chris, thank you both for that very warm and generous introduction, and thank you all for coming this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, for most of us in Australia, press freedom is an abstraction. It's an idea, it's a concept we can talk about, but not really put our fingers on. We open the papers and we see no end of criticism of the government. Journalists are apparently free to say pretty much what they like, and we don't see government critics being dragged off in manacles as they are in Turkey, or lying dead in a ditch in the way that my colleagues in Mexico often wind up. Even for those of us who work in the industry, press freedom can feel a bit woolly. It's a thing we know we need, but we're hardly ever aware of. A bit like oxygen, it's simply there, an essential part of life that we barely ever stop to consider. Even for those of us who work in the industry, like oxygen, when you're deprived of freedom as a journalist, it's almost impossible to think of anything else. Well, for me, on December 28th of 2013, that fuzzy concept became a very concrete, gasping reality. Back then, I was working as a journalist for Al Jazeera. I'd been called to Cairo to cover the Christmas-New Year period as the country's ongoing political drama was unfolding. An interim administration installed by the military was asserting its authority over Egypt after a coup forced its first democratically elected government from power 6 months earlier. That ousted government was the Muslim Brotherhood, and we were doing what any responsible journalist would have done, talking to all the main groups involved. Around that time, the interim administration had begun introducing new national security laws that made it a crime to advocate terrorist ideology. Now, there's nothing unusual in that, but the legal definitions were so loosely drawn that terms like national security and terrorism had come to mean anything that the government didn't like. I was aware of the law, of course, but I also took the government at its word when it said it was committed to upholding press freedom. Well, that night, December 28th, I was in my hotel room getting ready to go out for dinner when the police barged in, ransacked the room, and threw me in the cells along with 2 of my colleagues. A few days later, we learned the charges. We were accused of aiding and abetting a terrorist organisation, being members of a terrorist organisation, financing terrorism, publishing terrorist ideology, and broadcasting false news with intent to undermine national security. The charges were about as serious as you could get, short of actually throwing a grenade into a crowded room like this one. Now, crucially, apart from our stories, the agents were looking for our sources and contacts. They were targeting the relationships that lie at the very heart of journalism. With that history in mind then, you can imagine how it felt for me when back in June of 2019, I saw those images of Australian Federal Police pushing their way into the home of News Corp journalist Annika Smethurst and going through the ABC's files, looking at using national security legislation to look for the sources of their stories. It's worth going back to the stories that News Corp and the ABC published. Annika was reporting on a discussion within the government about expanding the powers of the Australian Signals Directorate, our international electronic eavesdropping agency. Home Affairs wanted to give it the authority to use its incredibly sophisticated tools to snoop on domestic communications. Annika didn't expose anything that genuinely damaged security. There was no information about the technology itself, and nor did she name anyone who worked there. What she did was uncover a debate about something that would have exposed the communications of every Australian to electronic eavesdropping. Now, whatever you think of the idea, that kind of policy change is very much in the public interest. And in a democracy, it ought to be open for public debate. And what about the ABC? Well, there the police were looking for the sources of stories alleging war crimes by Australian Special Forces in Afghanistan. Again, the ABC was careful not to expose details that might put serving soldiers at risk. And I'd argue that when there is evidence that our own soldiers are involved in allegations of, or allegedly involved in murdering unarmed civilians, then it is very much in the public interest. Those stories, by the way, ultimately led to the Brereton inquiry into the conduct of Australian SAS in Afghanistan. Now, apart from being controversial, both stories relied on leaked classified information. The problem is that in Australian law, simply receiving classified information, whether you sought it or not, could be regarded as a federal crime. Of course, disclosing that information to a journalist or anyone else, being a source in other words, is also very much against the law. So what do we do in a situation where there is a compelling public interest in journalists exposing a story about the behaviour of our government or its agencies, and an equally compelling obligation for the police to enforce the law? Well, I'll come to that in a minute. But I mentioned my case in the AFP raids not to suggest that Australia is about to become Egypt. We still do live in a democracy and our press remains relatively free. But the political imperatives that allowed Egypt to introduce loosely framed national security legislation that they then used to silence uncomfortable journalism are the same ones that allowed Australia to introduce, yes, loosely framed national security legislation that was then used to go after uncomfortable journalism. So how did we wind up in a situation where Australian journalists can become police targets using draconian security laws that criminalise reporting that most of us would be considered to be both important and legitimate? How did we wind up in a situation where the New York Times suggested Australia may well be the world's most secretive democracy? To answer that question, we need to go back 2 decades to September 11th of 2001. Those shocking attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon and our collective response made security the overriding political imperative of the past 2 decades. While the attacks themselves were primarily primary provocation, the then US President George W. Bush stepped into the trap when he addressed a special joint session of Congress and declared, in his war on terror, let me rephrase that. George W. Bush stepped into the trap when he addressed a special joint session of Congress and declared his war on terror. Crucially, you'll recall that he told a special joint session of Congress, in this war, you are either with us or you are with the terrorists. And I'd invite you to hold on to that quote for a few moments. Now, at the time, with the dust from the attacks still hanging in the air, it was hard to disagree with President Bush. But with the value of hindsight, it is now clear that in that speech, he created a binary, an us versus them choice that made it incredibly difficult to question anything the state might do in the name of national security. If you did, you risked being accused of picking the wrong side. He created a situation where if you challenged some new security law on the grounds that it might be eroding human rights or an overreach of state power, you'd be regarded as treasonous. The language of war, security and terrorism has now seeped into the political discourse around the globe. The world's biggest jailers of journalists, China, Turkey and Egypt, have done it using anti-terrorism legislation. As of December 31st last year, there was a record number of journalists in prison, 293 according to the Committee for the Protection of Journalists. Almost 3/4 of them are there on what the CPJ describes as crimes against the state. That's things like treason, sedition, and, yes, terrorism. The problem with that term terrorism is that it's incredibly slippery. A friend once dryly quipped that the war on terror is a war on an abstract noun. It means whatever you want it to mean. In Egypt, obstructing a civil servant is regarded as an act of terrorism. It turns out that interviewing a member of the Muslim Brotherhood is also an act of terror. But I'm not here to talk about the rest of the world. I'm here to talk about our own country, Australia. And here, the securitization of public debate and policy making has underpinned an extraordinary seizure of power by the state often at the expense of civil liberties. We've been world leaders in passing security laws. Now, I'm not for a second suggesting that there isn't a problem that needs to be addressed, but it is worth unpacking the extent of our legislation. A few researchers have been keeping score. According to a tally by my colleagues at the University of Queensland, at least 92 have passed through Parliament since 2001. Our rate of lawmaking has been so energetic that a Canadian researcher, Kent Roach, called it hyper-legislation, and that was back in 2012 when we passed only 50. Now, I've seen what terrorism looks up close and personally. In places like Afghanistan, Somalia, and Kenya, I've lost dear friends to terrorism, and on several occasions I've come close to being killed myself. And in this lecture on press freedom and national security, I am not being so naive as to suggest that the press should have complete freedom either. I know what terrorism is and why we need to protect ourselves. But let's go back to the first principles of classic liberal democratic theory. We're familiar with the usual three pillars of democracy: the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary, with the media working as the fourth estate. And in that model, journalists track the work of our elected officials and civil servants. They oil debate with good quality information and keep the public informed of the policies that are being enacted in our name. They monitor the behaviour of the government that works for us, that we hire each election, and whose salaries we pay through our taxes. In recent years, a few academics have gone beyond that fourth estate idea. James Carey, an American communications theorist and media critic at the University of Illinois, argued that journalism is the sine qua non of democracy. Now, in an essay published in 1999, he said, "Journalism and politics cannot be thought of as two separate independent domains. Rather, they are symbiotically connected. They can only be known via their mutual and active adaptations, which are cooperative and antagonistic by turns. One can only be known in light of the other." He then went on to say that every conception and practice of politics is simultaneously a conception of journalism, and every conception of journalism is simultaneously a conception of politics. Now, the implication of Carey's observation is that even though they look like separate institutions, the two are so deeply interconnected that if structural change happens to one, it must inevitably affect the other. That might explain why the digital disruption the media is grappling with now coincides with a deterioration of political debate. That's a subject of another discussion, of course, but the point I want to make here is that if we agree with Carey, then any legislated erosion of media freedom is going to have an impact on the political process itself. A free media is important in other ways too. A joint paper published by the academics from Georgia State University and the University of Wisconsin and the World Bank Institute in 2011 was titled "Media Freedom, Socio-Political Stability and Economic Growth." Its authors found a direct link between those three ideas. They argued that a free media promotes socio-political stability by pushing the government to act in the interests of voters. That stability provides a favourable business climate, which in turn promotes investment. Now, at the risk of stating the blindingly obvious, one of the big lessons since World War II is that an open democracy with a genuinely free media means more political stability, more social harmony, and more economic prosperity. And let me cite one more paper here. This one is called "Financing Dies in Darkness: The Impact of Newspaper Closures on Public Finance." In 2018, a team of American economists got their calculators out and looked at the costs of running local government in communities that had lost their local newspapers. The researchers found that when journalists disappeared from local council meetings, when they weren't keeping track of debates or monitoring the hiring and contracting decisions, the costs of the council went up. And not just by a little bit. They found that the costs to ratepayers almost invariably exceeded the costs of running the newspapers that had closed. Crucially, they found the connection was more than mere correlation. The closure of the papers caused the rise in costs. Now, this might seem like a deviation from my main theme around security, but I think it's central. If national security means anything at all, surely it must be about protecting not only our lives and property, but also the integrity of the entire political system that's made our country one of the most peaceful, wealthy and prosperous places on earth. So, any security legislation that undermines press freedom, that unnecessarily limits the ability of journalists to investigate government, and that exposes journalists' sources, ultimately damages the very system it is trying to protect. After the AFP raids, the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence Security launched an inquiry into press freedom and national security. My colleagues and I from the Alliance for Journalist Freedom appeared before the committee, and there several members spoke about striking the right balance between those two principles. Now, frankly, I disagree with the idea of balance. The term implies a zero-sum trade-off. It suggests that if you have more of one, you must have less of the other. The concept of balance in this context means that if we want to remain secure, we must cede some measure of transparency, and in the case of journalists, restrict their ability to investigate government and hold them to account. Now, I simply don't accept that's the case. In a functioning democracy, there is a necessary tension between the two institutions. Security agencies and the media are never going to be best buddies, not if the overriding obligation of the former is to keep secrets, and of the latter it is to expose them. But both are essential elements of a stable, secure political system. Let me say that again. A free press is a part of our national security framework. Let's have a look at some examples that are a bit more tangible than the academic papers we've just been discussing. Think of the parliamentary inquiries, the royal commissions and the reforms that have happened as a direct result of journalism that exposed corruption, mismanagement or abuses of power. The Fitzgerald inquiry in Queensland followed the work of the ABC's Chris Masters and brought down the Bjelke-Petersen government. The Banking Royal Commission came after Adele Ferguson's story in the Sydney Morning Herald. And the Northern Territory, a Four Corners investigation into the Dondale Detention Centre triggered the Royal Commission into protection and detention of children. After the Tax Office raided Richard Boyle, after the Tax Office official Richard Boyle went to the media to expose the ATO's robo-debt policies, we saw the whole system scrapped. And after the ABC published a series of leaks from a military lawyer about allegations of war crimes, yes, those leaks, the government ordered the Brereton report and promised prosecutions and reforms that are still underway. Now, I could spend all night listing stories that would never have come to light if it weren't for journalists poking around in the dark corners of government. Without them, those issues would have continued to fester, undermining our security and our stability. But I want to call attention to the way so many of our security laws smother the media's capacity to investigate government and its security agencies, and in many cases place individual reporters and their sources at serious risk of imprisonment. Let me give a few examples. When I came home from Egypt in early 2015, the government had just passed the Data Retention Act of 2014. The Act compels telecoms companies to hold on to the metadata of every Australian for at least 2 years and make it available to a host of government agencies. Amid a fierce debate about protecting private information, the then Attorney General George Brandis sold it as essential for disrupting terrorist communications and investigating serious crimes. The Home Affairs website says metadata is used in most serious criminal and national security investigations, including murder, counter-terrorism, counter-espionage, sexual assault and kidnapping cases. In the legislation, there's a list of 22 law enforcement agencies that have the power to investigate the metadata of any Australian without a warrant. In 2018, the Communications Alliance, which represents telecoms companies, reported that in 1 year alone, its members had received 350,000 requests for metadata. That's more than 1,000 every working day. The following year, the Alliance gave the PJCIS a list of 80 agencies that had used a legal backdoor to ask for metadata, including the Victorian Institute of Teaching, the Taxi Service Commission, and the Rockdale City Council. Apparently, the council wanted to track down illegal dumping. And the Communications Alliance also admitted that the list was probably incomplete. There are obviously troubling implications for our own privacy and civil liberties, but what about journalists? Well, any agency looking to dig out a journalist's source looking to dig into a journalist source has to get a special journalist information warrant. The whole warrant process is secret. We don't even know who issues them, so there's no input from journalists themselves, much less their lawyers. We do know that in the 2017-2018 financial year, the AFP accessed journalist metadata at least 58 times. But here's the thing. There's no need to get a warrant if you want to dig into the metadata of someone the police or one of those other random agencies thinks might have been talking to a journalist. The situation is now so serious that most news organisations are advising their reporters to only use encrypted communications with confidential sources. But that option's also been compromised. The Telecommunications Amendments Act, passed in 2018, forces anybody who works in the telecoms industry to help security agencies hack into encrypted communications. That effectively makes it impossible to guarantee the safety and the identity of our sources. Then there's the Espionage and Foreign Interference Act, also passed in 2018. Under that Act, current or former Commonwealth officers communicating information likely to harm Australia's interests risks being locked up for 7 years. If the information is classified or the source held a security classification, then they may have committed an aggravated offence, risking 10 years behind bars. A paper in the forthcoming Melbourne University Law Review examines the impact of the Espionage Act on journalism. And that paper says that current espionage offences pose a significant risk of criminalising legitimate journalism, and that this, in combination with their staggering complexity and uncertain scope, is contributing to the chilling of public interest journalism in Australia. In all likelihood, the ABC couldn't have run the Afghan files if the Espionage Act had been in force when it published them back in 2017. Now, I've got no problem with laws that protect genuinely sensitive information. Governments need to keep secrets. As we saw in the AFP raids on Annika Smethurst and the ABC in 2019, the law was used to go after sources who did not expose anything that might directly compromise security, just stories that were politically embarrassing. Of course, since the outrage that followed those AFP raids, we haven't seen reporters being dragged off in manacles, but research by my colleagues at the University of Queensland shows the laws are working in ways they are supposed to. That's as a deterrent. Cash-strapped editors are increasingly bailing out of contentious investigations because of the costs and stresses of fighting it out in court. At the same time, the risks of blowing up your career, being dragged into court, facing massive legal costs and extreme stress is enough to frighten off all but the bravest of sources. No potential whistleblower is going to look at the nightmares that the likes of David McBride or Bernard Collaery have been through and think, well, that was worth it. A huge part of the problem is that Australia has no legal protection for press freedom. There is nothing that specifically says it is a right to be protected. All we have is that infamous implied freedom of political communication inferred in our Constitution. Now, as a reminder, a few years ago, the High Court ruled that because our Constitution describes a system of representative democracy, and you can't have representative democracy without the freedom of political communication, that right is implied. Indeed, in one recent High Court ruling, a dissenting judge argued that it might not even exist. And even if it does, it is hopelessly weak. It imposes no positive obligation to protect the freedom of the press or of speech, and indeed it acts as an inferred restraint on legislative overreach. And we've already seen how that works. Now, this is not just a giant moan about the failures of our political and legal system. I do have some ideas about how we might fix this. My colleagues and I at the Alliance for Journalist Freedom have been doing some thinking about what a coherent system of media freedom might look like. And I use that term system quite deliberately. I'm not just talking about legislative changes. I think the media must also make some reforms of its own. First, there's the problem of the law. We're not advocating for constitutional amendment, although that would be ideal, but we are realistic enough to recognise that in Australia, journalists are about as popular as pornographers. Very few people are likely to vote for a constitutional change that gives them more freedom rather than tarring and feathering the lot. We also don't think you'd need to go through every single piece of legislation and insert an obligation to protect journalists. In their search warrant for the ABC, the Federal Police cited the Crimes Act, which makes it an offence to receive stolen Commonwealth property. Now, no politician is going to vote for a law that says it's okay for journalists to receive stolen property, even if there is a clear public interest. Instead, a far more elegant solution is a Media Freedom Act. Now, in our conception, it would be a simple piece of legislation that would work on 3 levels. First, it would require legislators to account for the impact of any law on press freedom before passing it. Second, in any cases involving the media, the courts would be required to interpret the law in ways that privilege press freedom. And finally, it would make a civil servant act in ways that support press freedom. Now, this isn't a new concept. It's exactly the way that the Human Rights Acts work in the ACT and Queensland. Whenever we have these conversations with lawmakers, we're constantly asked the same question. Who is a journalist? Who should any law protecting press freedom actually apply to? It is a vexed problem and one that academics in the industry have been wrestling with for years. The problem, of course, is the way that the digital revolution has turned anyone with a mobile phone and a social media account into a publisher. So how do we make a meaningful distinction between a reporter live tweeting from a violent demonstration and one of the organisers using Twitter to call in reinforcements? Should the police stop one and not the other? Well, in my view, trying to nail down a legal definition of who is a journalist is a fool's errand. Rather than trying to draw a line around the who, we ought to be focusing on the how. And by that, I mean the journalistic process. Now remember, after the AFP raids, both the then Home Affairs Minister Peter Dutton and the Prime Minister Scott Morrison said that journalists could not place themselves above the law. They couldn't think of themselves as a self-appointed elite publishing things that nobody else could. And I agree. But the whole point of press freedom isn't to protect a particular group of individuals. It's to protect, rather, their democratic role. We need a group of individuals, we need a group of people who reliably collect and report accurate, credible, authoritative information in the public interest and who can investigate and hold the government to account. If you dig past the job title, you'll find it all depends on the way information is gathered, organised and presented. Underpinning the whole journalistic enterprise is a set of professional practices, standards, obligations and ethics. And that's where I think we should turn for a legal definition. Now again, this is not especially new. It already exists in our statutes. Section 126K of the Victorian Evidence Act gives journalists the right to protect their sources in court. And in setting out its definitions, the Act starts the traditional way. It says, journalist means a person engaged in the profession or occupation of journalism. Now, I'm uncomfortable with that bit, of course, because it shuts out a lot of people who are part-timers or volunteers who work for community radio news services, academics like myself who do a bit of journalism on the side, student journalists and so on. Folks who are not necessarily in the profession or occupation of journalism, but who still practice to a standard and deserving of legal protection. But here's the critical bit. The Act then goes on to say, the person or publisher of the information, comment, opinion or analysis is accountable to comply through a complaints process with recognised journalistic or media professional standards or codes of practice. And I think that line contains a bit of legal genius. It's reasonable to assume that if someone declares a commitment to a set of standards and ethics and then gives the public a way of complaining if they deviate from it, then they're working to a much higher standard than your average social media star. I don't see satirists or bloggers making themselves accountable to the code of practice published by the MEAA, the Journalists' Union. And if they do, well, they're probably practicing journalism. In that way, we avoid singling out any group for special treatment. Instead, we protect the role they play by defining the process they use. It takes us back to the reason we elevate press freedom in the first place. But the media itself also has a job to do here. Apart from a relatively brief trust bump when people turned to mainstream media during the COVID crisis, we've seen a steady decline in public confidence in conventional news. Part of the reason is self-inflicted, but a lot has to do with the fact that legitimate journalism occupies the same online real estate as conspiracy theorists and rumour mongers. It's becoming increasingly hard to distinguish the good from the rubbish. But what if the industry used that process of journalism as the basis for a system of voluntary certification? It could establish a certification board that would examine the work of anyone claiming to be producing journalism, and if they understand the law and they're applying those processes appropriately, they could get a little kite mark to go next to their byline, a bit like Twitter's blue tick. That way, readers and audiences would have a way of recognising journalism created to a professional standard, and if the producers of that work deviated from the standard too much, the board would have the powers of sanction. But let me emphasise that certification must be entirely voluntary, and it must be managed by the industry, and certainly not the government. It works with the Media Freedom Act too. Anyone who has been certified would get what's known as a rebuttable presumption. The courts would start by assuming that they are working to a professional standards, and that it would be up to the prosecution to show why they had failed to meet their obligations. It would stick a thumb on the scales in favour of press freedom rather than against it, as is the case now. Anyone who isn't certified wouldn't be prevented from benefiting from the law, but it would be up to those uncertified journalists to show the court that they are meeting the required standards. In short, I'm proposing a comprehensive system of reform. The government should introduce a Media Freedom Act. In exchange, the media should set up a system of voluntary certification that would uphold standards of professional practice. And the two would be linked by a legal definition of journalism as a process. Now, all this is important not just because of what it means for us journalists. It's important because of the impact the erosion of journalism is having on our democracy, on our capacity to have nuanced, complex political debates, on the ability to interrogate, investigate those who hold the levers of power. It's chipping away at what one organisation calls the grey zone. And by that, this organisation means the space that is essential for a pluralist society to work. They mean the region of tolerance that makes it possible for different ethnicities, religions, cultures and political beliefs to coexist and thrive together without collapsing into communal or sectarian violence. That zone makes it not just possible, but desirable to challenge authority, to ask difficult questions of those in charge. The grey zone is where we tolerate difference and have arguments without getting violent. It's the region that journalists, writers, academics and thinkers occupy. The grey zone is the space that has made Australia one of the most stable, prosperous places on earth for more than 200 years. So, guess what organisation uses the term? It's not Amnesty International or some progressive think tank. It's Islamic State. IS has its own online magazine called Dabiq. A few years ago, it published a cover story titled The Extinction of the Grey Zone. The story explained how one of Islamic State's main strategies was to destroy that democratic space by making it impossible for Muslims and other cultures to live side by side. They wanted to create a world where you can't question your rulers. They wanted to create a world of binaries where you're either an Islamic friend or an apostate enemy. In that cover story, the author quoted someone who they said was particularly helpful in that goal. It was George W. Bush. And the line they cited? Well, it was from that speech in the joint session of Congress, either you are with us or you are with the terrorists. Now, in my work under regimes of all stripes, I've noticed that there seems to be a sliding scale, with freedom of speech at one end and a police state at the other. In the current environment, it is all too easy, too tempting for governments to use the war on terror as a convenient excuse to drag the slider to the right, to claim more power in the interests of national security, trading off the media's oversight role in the process. Even if we wanted to live in a police state, history suggests that can never really deal with terrorism, and that perversely, the best way to tackle extremism of any sort is to keep an open, accountable society with the media free to do its job, interrogating not just governments, but those whose opinions drift off into the political extremes. It was the French philosopher Albert Camus who said that a free press can, of course, be both good and bad, but a press that is not free can never be anything but bad. Thank you.
Thanks very much. We're now going to have a panel discussion. We've got two very distinguished guests with us, one of whom is just getting mic'd up. Fran Kelly is an Australian radio presenter, current affairs journalist and political correspondent who hosted the ABC's Radio National breakfast program for a very long time and seems a wonderfully familiar voice to all of us. Fran's well known for her current affairs journalism and political correspondence. Chris Buckley is the Chief China correspondent for the New York Times and has covered Chinese politics, foreign policy, rural issues, human rights, social and environmental issues, and lately the Xinjiang region in Western China. He's lived in China for most of the past 30 years after growing up in Sydney. Before joining the Times in 2012, he was a correspondent in Beijing for Reuters. What we're going to do now is Fran and Chris are just going to sit over here, and I think we're just going to have a bit of a panel exchange here, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. Okay, who wants to go first here?
Thank you, Peter, for that incredibly well thought out premise and a list of suggestions, and that I think the notion of a Media Act is a terrific notion, and I note that it was one that came before the Senate inquiry into press freedom that was just one of two inquiries that followed the raids on Annika Smethurst's place and the ABC. Both the inquiries came up with pretty strong findings that there needed to be more press freedom. None of them came up with any really extreme measures to achieve it, and certainly the notion of a Media Freedom Act was not really taken on board by either of them. It was noted by the Greens in the second one. But I think the overall finding from those two inquiries, which were called quite urgently off the back of the uproar of the side of those police raids, have ended up in certainly hardly any change, if any change, since legislative change. So I think this is a job of work for the new government. They, Labor in opposition, heartily endorsed the findings of both the I always get this wrong, PJCIS, yeah, and the Senate inquiry. And now it's their job to make sure something is done about it, because the best we got out of the former Attorney General, Christian Porter at the time, was that he is not of a mind to arrest journalists, and that doesn't give anyone any great peace of mind, I don't think. So a Media Freedom Act, yes, I think is a terrific idea. The other ideas I think we'll discuss further in the room tonight. I think there's probably going to be some curveballs delivered at you, Peter, for those. I remember when Stephen Conroy tried to bring in some kind of accreditation for the press. The major newspaper were not all that impressed by the idea. So I think there's that problem. There's always also the issue that in this day and age, the question of who's a journalist, and it was one that beleaguered completely the Senate committee and the other committee too. Who is a journalist? What is the public interest? How do we define those? It's just sort of changing and morphing all the time before our very eyes. And I'm not sure that the idea of a tick or what was it going to be?
It's not certification.
Yeah, I don't quite know how that can be fleet of foot enough and not get bogged down in some kind of central, do you have to sign up to the MEAA? That means you have to pay fees. That means, it seems to be almost an accumulation of power, again, in the hands of some sort of body. Who is that body and who's watching the watcher? I'm just not sure how that would work, but you're right, something needs to happen for journalism to get a better reputation. And like Camus said, free press is good and bad, and that's true. How we lift our game, I think, is a big part of this discussion.
Maybe Peter to respond to that.
Well, I'll let Chris make some remarks, and then we can talk a little bit.
Okay, thanks, Peter. I'll be very brief. First of all, I should say I am a New York Times journalist, but I'm not the one who said that Australia was the most secretive democracy in the world or country in the world. That's my colleague Damien Cave, although I find myself in agreement with him these days on that point. So I spent a lot of time in China as a journalist, covering the country for over 20 years, particularly over the past decade when, especially after Xi Jinping came to power, we saw the increasing demolition and retreat of what had been in China a growing community of journalists and activists and human rights lawyers who were expanding that grey zone in China. And seeing that grey zone disappear in a country in less than 10 years, when I was forced to leave China in 2020 and come back to Australia, I've always felt that it's made me much more aware of just how brittle and vulnerable the freedoms that we have are, and how important it is for a country like Australia to vigorously protect those freedoms. So it's really good to hear Peter talking about these issues, and for Macquarie University to open up a discussion about these issues. I was thinking today as well, many of you may have seen that overnight in Geneva, I believe it was, the UN Human Rights Commission commissioner issued her report on her investigation of Xinjiang in Western China and the allegations there of abuses of human rights, particularly of the Uyghur ethnic minority. Her report came out and says that there may well have been crimes against humanity committed there through mass detentions and many of the other policies that have been inflicted on Uyghurs and other minorities. Now, that report didn't come out of simply their investigations. A lot of it came out of journalism. Certainly not just the New York Times. I hope we played a part, but a lot of journalistic efforts by a lot of journalists in China who were putting themselves at considerable risk of being accused of violating China's even more expansive definitions of national security. So it's very important to remember that when a democracy like Australia makes these retreats on freedom of speech, when it carves out these areas of exception to public scrutiny and to open judicial processes, other countries see that. Governments like China see that. And when it comes up to these discussions about how we uphold and protect universal values about human rights, when Australia makes these arbitrary retreats in its own standards of human rights, that has implications for what happens in China and other countries as well. So that's something that we also have to be aware of when we think about the rules that we apply to our own society. I've said enough, but I should say, just like Fran, I do wonder about walking around with a dog collar and a tag saying journalist as well.
Well, I'm proud to do it, but
I would be as well, but I can see it could open up all sorts of complications. And I also do wonder, even if the system is voluntary, I think we can see how these voluntary processes can calcify in time into more restrictive ones that can have their own problems. So let's open up the conversation about that now. I've spoken too much.
no, you haven't spoken too much at all, not in my view anyway. Just before we get to that, I'd just like to add that just a memory I had, Peter, as you spoke, and you talked about the grey zone and you talked about those George W. Bush comments. And I remember working as a journalist, and perhaps Alan and others here remember too, when the ABC, I forget the reporter, George Roberts, I think, reported on some treatment of refugees who were coming here by boat, and the boat was apprehended. And it was, with burnt hands, holding the hands. And Tony Abbott was Prime Minister at the time, and he said something like, I haven't got the exact quote to my memory, but something like, it's hard to work out sometimes whose side the ABC is on. And I found that such a chilling, to me, that was a comment from a Prime Minister way beyond anything we'd ever heard publicly before. I'd already picked up, we all had, but all of us working in the area, picked up a growing animosity amongst politicians, some politicians of some stripes, to the ABC, a big change particularly within the National Party, because they used to be our biggest friend in Parliament House, and these days most of them are not that. But that was such a stark, unfettered comment, and I found it incredibly chilling, and I think it did have a chilling effect on some of our reporting and attitudes in the days that followed. I just make that comment.
So I've got this other microphone. I recognise, and we're very aware that the whole question of certification is going to be controversial. We knew it would be when we proposed this idea, but there are a couple of reasons why, a couple of things that emphasise. First of all, I think the voluntary nature of it helps a lot. I think that there needs to be, and I think it needs to be something that is entirely controlled by the industry. As it is, we have a number of industry organisations that are responsible for maintaining standards. There's ACMA, the Australian Communications and Media Authority, which looks after the broadcast industry, and we've got the Australian Press Council, looks after press, and neither of those do those things particularly well. And so I think we need to reform the way that those institutions, that system of self-regulation by the industry actually operates. But what we're trying to do is figure out, think very deeply about how the government, how the industry could respond to the idea of a Media Freedom Act with the definition of journalism as a process, and what benefits, how do we apply those benefits? If we allow, if we make no assumptions about people coming before the courts, then everybody has to demonstrate that they're working to a professional standard. And we think that if you can have a rebuttable presumption, then that provides both a powerful positive incentive for journalists to work for accreditation and not accreditation, for certification, and apply those professional standards consistently. We think that will help journalism broadly as an industry. It provides a kind of legal top cover, a presumption of legal top cover, as well as provide a way in which social media companies can boost that content. Now, we need to be very clear in any legislation that that system of certification cannot be used as a barrier to entry. It can't stop anybody from working as a journalist. It can't ever be used as a tool for filtering out who gets access and who doesn't, who's allowed to ask questions and who isn't. But we still think that there needs to be a way of identifying work that is produced to a standard and separating that stuff out from a lot of the other content. And that's really what we're trying to achieve here. And that's also why we think that responsibility has to remain squarely with industry and not with any government or association or authority.
There would be immediate questioning, though, wouldn't there, of whether those standards are already being eroded within the professional journalism milieu. You know, that those who would get that tick, who are accountable to those organisations, whether there's certainly not uniformity across that, and there's a lot of debate about whether standards within the agreed definition of journalism and what it means are changing and slipping in this world of 24-hour media, in this world of balkanised media, in this world of a more opinionated media.
And that's precisely why we think there needs to be a reform of the whole system of self-regulation and setting of standards. And again, this isn't particularly new. I mean, the Australian Institute of Company Directors runs courses. They certify people who've been through those processes, those courses. You don't have to go through the AICD's process to be recognised or to operate as a company director. It just provides an extra level of training and accountability and authority through that process. And so, again, there are models. I recognise that journalism is very different because of the position that it occupies in relation to government. But the concept broadly still operates, still works, and is still broadly accepted in a lot of areas.
One question that it raised in my mind is, as you say, the internet these days can be, it can be a jungle or a cesspool sometimes, but it can be a wonderful resource as well. And I think we've seen instances where, stories have grown, not because of journalistic endeavours, but because of bloggers online or people on social media. And again, I'm sorry about my narrow experience, but I think of China again, and the fact that the first reports about what we now know as COVID didn't come out of journalism, didn't come out of Chinese newspapers, but out of social media websites. And you can imagine similar scenarios in any society. And I think I'm going back to my failed efforts to study law, but some system that would perhaps introduce the kinds of changes you're talking about, but also introduce the kinds of changes that would recognise a sliding scale, whereby people, bloggers on the internet or so on, or showing my age when I talk about bloggers now, aren't I? But people on the internet who are doing legitimate work without being journalists can also receive some sort of protection before the courts when they're arrested, when they face some sort of court action. I think that might be a sort of a health way of encouraging this sort of civil society that you're talking about as well.
And we aren't proposing that anybody who isn't certified should not get the benefit of the law. What we're simply saying is that if you aren't certified, then you still can enjoy legal protection under a Media Freedom Act. You just need to do a little bit more work to demonstrate that you're actually working to a particular standard. This is not, by the way, so certification doesn't mean that anyone who isn't certified can't work. Anybody can still produce works of journalism. In no way does what we're proposing close down freedom of speech. That must also remain. The ability of bloggers, of citizen journalists, of ordinary folk to publish and produce in no way is limited by what we're proposing. All we're saying is that work that meets a certain professional standard that most of us would recognise as good journalism gets the benefit of protection under a Media Freedom Act.
You know, the recommendations from at least one of those committees was a harmonisation of the state's media shield laws, which hasn't happened yet, I don't think. So we still need those laws in place, because as soon as you have those laws of media freedom shields, you've got the question of who's a journalist.
Yeah, exactly. And so what we're saying is, never mind who is a journalist, as long as you are applying your professional processes, whether you're certified or not, as long as you are working to a particular professional standard and accountable to those standards, then you should get the benefit of the legal protection. Let me go back to the key point that I was trying to make here, that we need to make sure that we protect the role that the media, or that journalism is supposed to play in a democracy. We're trying to identify it and protect that. This is separate to freedom of speech. Freedom of the press is a subset of freedom of speech. Now, in Australia, we don't have any explicit protection of freedom of speech beyond the implied freedom of political communication, and that itself is problematic. What we're proposing doesn't in any way limit or restrain or affect freedom of speech. It doesn't affect bloggers. All that we're saying is that if you're a journalist and you're working to a standard, certified or not, you should be allowed to have the protection of the Media Freedom Act, which still works in the context of the other laws that we're talking about.
The other thought that came to mind, Peter, is whatever enhanced protection of freedom of the press means in Australia, I think one of the conversations that has to happen, including in this room, is about how you get there. How do you get to that legislation? How do you get to that stronger protections? And part of that is, again, the grey zone civil society, and thinking about those questions about how journalists, universities, citizens can sort of build up that pressure to greater protections for valuable journalism. And I think one of the problems is that when you talk about national security threats, they can sound unimaginably terrifying. It's the worst that could possibly happen. It's a terrorist attack. It's a biosecurity attack. It's something like that. Whereas on the other hand, with freedom of the press, it often seems that the benefits for society are so intangible. Like, what have you given me from your freedom of the press? So I think some sort of effort to address both of those things, what national security actually involves and legitimately involves in a society, and what the tangible benefits of freedom of the press are, I think that would be helpful. For example, I was just astonished by what you said about collection of metadata in Australia. That's really disturbing.
Yeah, I think we'll open up for questions. Any questions? Back, I'll pass the microphone, so please identify yourself briefly. And then.
Hello, Broughton Robinson, an important subject, and I certainly support media law. I'm not sure about the certification issue, but definitely something that would allow courts to balance whether it's national security legislation or other legislation, the relative public interest of journalists doing their business. My question is, national security legislation, as I understand, it's basically been the last 2 decades. There's been a big upsurge post 9/11, Bali bombings, etc. A much longer term problem in Australian law is defamation law, and there's examples where that's impacted journalists. And just for comparison, what would the journalists in front of us think, which is more of a problem at the moment, defamation law or national security law in general?
Well, both are problematic in Australia. There's a reason why the Murdochs, Lachlan Murdoch is suing Crikey in Australia and not suing the multiple news organisations that have made similar and far more serious allegations in the United States, and that's because our legislation, our defamation law is far more forgiving for plaintiffs than it is for the media, and I think that's a very serious problem. There's been an attempt to modify defamation law and harmonise it across the states. The jury almost literally is still out on whether that's working. In fact, we've got Robert Todd, who's a very experienced defamation lawyer in the room at the moment. And Robert, you might have some thoughts on this. But what we're talking about, I think, defamation is very much a related issue, and defamation law is also responsible for having a chilling effect because simply the costs and the difficulties of running and defending these cases is closing down a lot of legitimate journalism. It's still having a very serious chilling effect. I think that's a conversation that needs to be related to what we're talking about. The two things can't operate they operate independently of one another, almost on parallel tracks, although the effect on public discourse, the effect on the work of journalists is still broadly similar. It's still having a chilling effect. Fran?
Just add, particularly as someone who, when I was hosting RM Breakfast, fronting RM Breakfast, it was very frequently subjected to the lawyers' constraints on what we could say, usually in the context of defamation. And that seemed to be getting more and more frequent, I think, as the cases got more and more expensive. But it's also great to see that the ABC does back journalists. I mean, we've seen the whole Louise Milligan thing, but there's a number of stories that have come up in recent years, the last couple of years, where we just know that the whole story couldn't be told or get even close to being told because the lawyers had to go through it and because defamation risk was too high. And so it is having a significant regular effect on journalism, probably more so perhaps than the national security stuff at the moment, but in terms of the anti-terror laws. But I think overall, it's the same problem, and the federal government has promised it's going to do work around whistleblowers, it's promised it's going to do work around public interest disclosure, and I'm not clear on its position on defamation, but perhaps Robert is.
Hi, Austin here. I'm curious about your thoughts on Palantir, the security company, because we've got these sort of laxer, the encryption laws and all of that, and without really looking into it, I have a bit of a sneaking suspicion that Palantir are helping write those laws and then using Australia's relatively lax civil liberties regime to provide security services to the whole Five Eyes complex, and in a sense they've become a lobby as well and a player in the game. And I wonder if you could comment on that.
Austin, I'm not entirely sure where you're going with this, though. I mean, in what context? It's the...
Okay, well, so after the encryption laws were passed in 2018 or 19, was it? It was this vast open slather. We heard about these, international criminal gangs being taken down by Australia. People in Lebanon being arrested who are, operating international drug rings. And what they'd done is they launched their own encrypted phone app. They'd taken down the old one, and then it was a brilliant piece of police work, really. And it was, hard not to be impressed by it. But at the same time, it seems like they had to not just get permission to do what they were going to do, but get permission to do pretty much anything so that people wouldn't know what they were going to do. I mean, I'm reading the tea leaves a lot here, but Palantir is a huge company with all kinds of political connections, and they're very active in Australia. So Mike Kelly was the former MP in Eden Monaro and a very high-ranking member of a bunch of security committees and so forth. And he left and became head of president of Palantir Australia, which was a role created for him. You know, this is straight out of Parliament, classic revolving door stuff. I just wonder if I don't know. I'm just wondering if any of the panelists or anybody has any leads on that one.
I think, look, the thing that I'd say in relation to that is a more general comment, and that's, I think, the way in which there is a really solid thumb on the scales that privileges or favours anything to do with the security agencies and companies that work with them. Australia, you know, I think as Fran mentioned earlier, there's, or Chris in fact might have been, talking about the way in which security becomes the bogeyman that allows the government and its agencies and other companies to get away with pretty much anything. There's a sort of nudge and a wink that says, oh, you know, we can't tell you too much about this, but trust us, it's serious and dangerous, and if we don't act on this, if we don't take these powers, if we don't use these kinds of resources and technologies, then we're going to see blood in the streets. And so because we can't challenge that, because we don't have the capacity or the information to push back and say, no, what you're doing is a violation of civil liberties, it's overreach, you're seizing too much power, that stuff tends to sail through. And I think what we need to do, one of the things that we haven't really had, is a good strong debate, a good strong discussion about the limits of that power, whether it is really appropriate and necessary in the Australian context. We have had very few terrorist attacks on Australia, on Australian soil. That's possibly because our agencies are very good, but it's also possibly because actually the threat isn't that serious in Australia. And that in passing all of these laws, and someone mentioned that yes, that this stuff was all passed since 9/11. Before 9/11, there was precisely one statute on all of Australia's state and Commonwealth books that mentioned the word terrorism, and that was in the Northern Territory. Everything since then, every anti-terrorist act that we've had since has been passed since 9/11, because of this implied or this hinted at threat of terror. Now, as I said, I know terrorism. I've seen it up close and personal. I understand how serious it is. But I do think, and again, as Chris hinted at, that if we don't interrogate that I think is often what can be regarded as a seizure of state power very closely, and if we don't have an open public discussion about what we're trading off in exchange, then I think we're in the risk of sliding ever more seriously towards authoritarianism.
Also, and just to add to what you said, Peter, that the intelligence agencies say they have been very good at averting terrorism, and they've got a whole big number of attacks they've subverted. But be that as it may, I think too what we've seen is these laws brought in, particularly the more recent ones, and particularly going to the leak that Annika had about the Australian Signals Directorate, it's morphed from a terror threat to the threat of global child pornography rings, cybercrime, drug smuggling and weapons smuggling, so that they can use these encrypted, these powers, special powers, to clamp down on those. And I think some of those people are much more inclined to go, oh yeah, we do want to crack down on the global child pornography rings, for instance, so it's an easier sell in a way.
Hi all, I'm Annalise. Thank you so much for the conversation. I'm hoping this isn't outside of the scope of the discussion tonight, but I'm really interested in the public's role in this process. I know we've talked about legislative change, we've spoken about an attempt or the need for media to make an attempt with certification, but also what we're trying to protect here is what you've alluded to a lot throughout tonight is the grey zone and public discourse, right? And so beyond just the general fear-mongering that might come from the rhetoric of national security threats, we talked about digital disruption and algorithmically enabled echo chambers that are kind of leading to these omniscient beliefs. How do we reprioritize public discourse? How do we make Or how do we address this kind of rising complacency with civic participation amongst the majority of people and really prioritize that in our conversations? Because I think we're talking about the fourth estate and journalism fundamentally serving for a public good. How do we get the public on board with this good?
It is a great question. I think to a certain extent it falls outside the scope of what we're discussing this evening, because I think this is, in my view, what we have is a system that's designed around algorithms and technologies which function do what they're designed to do very, very well, and that's monetize attention for the corporations, the social media companies in California and offshore jurisdictions. What they're not designed for is us. They're not designed for public debate. They're not designed for public discussion. They're not designed for good democratic discourse. What they do is prioritize the sensational over the sober, and they prioritize polemic over serious analysis. They prioritize emotional discourse over sensible discussion. And so, in my view, because the social media companies have taken on the role of public utilities, we need to really seriously think about re-engineering those systems for us and not for them. But as I said, I think that's a bigger public discussion, bigger debate for a lot of other technologists. It's a little bit outside the scope of my own personal experience.
I would add, and this will probably sound very Pollyanna, that I think what we as journalists can do, and journalism organisations, is make sure that we fund journalism properly, that we have enough staff to cover stories properly, but also that individually, you know, it's hard to resist sometimes. If you're talking about the echo chambers and it's hard to resist what you know is going to get a headline or cross the bridge to the other echo chamber, which is, you know, we might call it gotcha journalism, or we might call it, oh, we've got to go there and get it first. These are, in my view, bad habits. And what we have to do all the time is we just have to do better at questioning ourselves all the time, or within our organisations, leadership questioning where we're going, what we're doing, how we do it, and making sure we have enough people and resources to do it properly. Because when you don't, that's when you take the shortcuts, that's when you take the bait, and that's when we're not doing anything to improve things. It's just making it worse, in my view.
I'll just add a couple of very short thoughts. One, because Fran is too modest to say it, but I think having a strong, well-funded, robust, unafraid public broadcast is a really good thing for a society. I think we see that in Australia. I think the BBC is another example of that. I think in societies where there's an absence of that, I think of the United States, I think you can see that it's something that takes away from having that forum where citizens can feel there's a reliable source of information, but a platform where they and their communities can also have a voice as well. So I think that's one thing. And just one other thought that's come up, I know it's not directly related to national security, but it is true that the culture of secrecy in Australian government is a real problem. You know, in the rare occasions when I've had to approach a federal ministry in Canberra for comment on something, you know, it's ridiculous, and it's almost always futile, and you get the sense that they're not even trying or don't even feel that they should be accountable to the public. Now, things may have changed. This was going back over the past year or two, but that general culture of secrecy, I think, then does lead to those problems that you're talking about, increase those problems you're talking about, you know, people willing to go along with these drastic reductions in freedom because they don't know what they're supposed to be afraid of, because there's a lack of accountability on issues that should be a matter of public debate and openness. And, you know, particularly now Australia's making momentous decisions on weapons acquisitions and so on, and the public debate about those issues and the consequences is virtually non-existent.
I think there's one more question down the front here.
Hi, Chris Katuki. Thanks so much for the talk. So we're talking about the timing parameters which the media can operate. But I also see the other end of the coin where we see an enormous concentration of media today. Not only that, in Australia, we've seen a destruction of local news media. So I'm wondering your opinions on the state of Australian media today, because it goes to the heart of national security as well, because if we don't have a functioning and healthy political debate and political discourse, it leads to all sorts of problems. So what are your opinions on the state of Australian media today and what needs to be done to encourage more diversity? Thank you.
Well, I'll go back to what I originally said about the point of protecting press freedom in the first place. Philosophers often talk about positive freedom and negative freedom. Negative freedom is freedom from, and generally interpreted as freedom from government interference or government involvement. That's certainly the way that the debate in Australia has focused on when it comes to media freedom arguments. So what we've done is say that the government shouldn't interfere in the media, it shouldn't interfere with questions of media ownership or media concentration. We should just let the market sort that out. But what that has effectively done is undermined the whole point of press freedom in the first place, which is the positive freedom of the public to have access to a wide range of good quality sources of information. And so I think that in losing sight of that fundamental purpose, we've seen the concentration of media ownership, we've seen the loss of diversity, we've seen the spread of what the industry often calls news deserts, particularly in regional Australia, where newspapers have closed down or altogether, and plenty of other places have been reduced to only one local source of news, one newspaper. And even in Brisbane, we really only have one printed newspaper, the Courier Mail, a News Corp paper. And I don't think that is healthy. I think we need to go back to the core reason that we protect press freedom in the first place, and that is to make sure the public has that positive freedom to have a wide range of good information.
Look, I'm agreeing with what Peter said and the premise of the question. I think that we've seen particularly the collapse of the regional media. Peter, I think you gave the example of the local governments. When the media weren't there, the spending went up. And that's precisely the example of that. When there's no one watching what's going on locally, all sorts of bad things will go on locally. And you can draw that out. It happened in a big city too. And yes, Brisbane has one newspaper. Adelaide has one newspaper. This is not good enough. And the laws collapsed a long time ago to allow this to happen. But, we have seen, for instance, the entry of The Guardian into our media landscape, and it has fought its way through to be a fairly, influential other voice as well, independent voice. So it is not impossible to do it, but generally the concentration has not been a good thing. And what we've seen with the collapse in the funding sources for the mainstream media is that it's having a very egregious effect, particularly in the regions immediately. And that's obvious. But it's also, it means we have fewer people in our bureaus. Following on from what Chris was saying, I first noticed it as a journalist in Parliament House, the lack of openness of our public servants and our ministries generally was when we were looking at trying to talk to Defence about anything really. And the Defence Department just gives out no information. And it was under the order of the minister. This is around the Kids Overboard time, but then during the Iraq War too, just nothing. And you could see all the information that was flowing out of the American Defence Department publicly, but that didn't happen in Australia. That's just got worse and worse and worse over my time trying to work within the political sphere and the public sector sphere. So, these are very bad habits, and they've been getting worse, I think. And I don't know how we turn it around, but when you're stripping bureaus of specialists, like we don't have, the numbers of people that used to be in a bureau, say for the Fairfax papers in the gallery compared to who's there now, means it's hard to get. We don't have so many defence specialists, for instance, foreign affairs specialists. It means you don't have people with the time and the capacity to develop the contacts within those places to get to the stories, to get to the information. So it all has this flow-on effect. and we're sort of like boiling frogs within it, I guess.
I just add one point, just from my very narrow perspective as a foreign correspondent now in Australia. When I was first starting off as sort of working as a stringer in China a long time ago for journalists travelling through, one of my first jobs was, I forget whether it was the Sun or the Daily Telegraph, but they used to have a journalist, I believe he was based in Hong Kong, who would come through to China and do the occasional story. And I think the one I helped him out on was about a racetrack somewhere, racehorses. But if you look now, Australian media outlets have no journalists in China. Now there's particular reasons for that, but it comes against a background in which, with reduced budgets, with newspapers under so much financial pressure or going under, the budget for foreign correspondence has been disappearing, and it's bloody expensive to have a foreign correspondent. It is, but I think it's also really worthwhile. And that, back to the theme of national security, if Australia wants to have if the Australian public wants to have a clear, accurate understanding of its relations with the rest of the world and countries like China and other big countries across Asia, it's really important to have our own journalists there and our own voices on the ground there explaining this to ordinary Australians, what's going on. And I think the fact that we don't have those correspondents there now is a palpable loss for the discussion about relations with China, relations with Asia. So that's a sort of an indirect national security issue there. But I think the lack of those correspondents on the ground now is having real consequences, whether it's because of politics or more often because of budgets.
And just on that question of public debate too, particularly around China, one of the things that tends to happen is that the debate domestically is dominated by the security hawks in Canberra, and that tends to shift the discourse in favour of the hawks. Now again, I'm not suggesting that we should necessarily shun them and take a more sort of generous and expansive and friendly view towards China. What I'm saying is that the debate is one-sided because we don't have those correspondents who are capable of covering China or the region in the way that we really need them to, because those stories just aren't part of the public discussion. So let's have one more question.
Yeah, right, come on, can't knock him back. He's the expert.
Lawyers should not be heard often in these. I just want to pick up on the sort of law reform aspect of it and what Peter's been suggesting. I've sat in a lot of rooms where law reform's discussed. The major problem that you have in getting reforms that are beneficial for media is you need an attitudinal shift. And to get an attitudinal shift amongst lawyers, you need to build some framework from which they can build from. So that's why I think the idea of having Peter's idea of an act or something that forces everyone when they sit down to say, well, we've got this and we've got to comply with this, how do we do it, is a very good idea. On the edges, I think having discussions about certification, whatever, is probably going to be destructive. But the other advantage of having that framework is that if you get it in place, then the judiciary have to view it through that prism. And that's the second step, because they don't. A lot of the views of lawyers and indeed many people in the community, they have this sort of paternalistic view of all of this legislation. Oh, it's there for protect us, etc. And that's a real problem in Australia. It's why we don't have the free speech rights they have in America, where they don't have that paternalistic view. So I think it's really important, if you want to get defamation reform, which is still ongoing, to actually change that attitude about the role of the press and entrench it in a really meaningful way, so that the next steps in the reform process can be taken.
No, thank you, Robert. I mean, I think effectively what you're suggesting is, because I mean, this is one of the reasons that we mentioned certification is that we think that politically it's much easier to sell this as a package. That if the government comes up with a Media Freedom Act, there's a response, there is an answer from the industry that says, here's how we fit into this framework. Here's how we can establish and help the courts understand what journalism as a process really is. And so it's not, I think politically it's an easier thing to sell, to get through. I recognise we've still got a lot of work to do, particularly for our colleagues in the media. It might well get shot down in the end, but that's a risk I'm prepared to take. I just think that as a model, if we think about it as a holistic piece of reform, as I mentioned in my lecture, a Media Freedom Act and a system of a process of a voluntary system of voluntary certification, the two connected by that definition of journalism, become something that I think can help both sides of the equation.
Look, thank you very much, everyone. We are unfortunately out of time. Before we adjourn for some cocktails and some food across the way there, please join me in thanking Peter, Fran and Chris for a provocative and lovely discussion about important issues. Thank you all.